Well, good afternoon again, and we're joined yet again today by Dr. Matthew Potter. Matt, it's as always great to have you on the other end of Skype. And you are, of course, curator of Limerick Museum and a knowledgeable man about many, many things in Limerick. In the current series, we've been looking at elements of sport in Limerick and how sport has developed over many, many years. And I suppose Limerick is a city that's built from its earliest times along the river. And all the biggest elements of our history, from the coming of the Norsemen through to the sieges of Limerick, to immigration and trade, they've all revolved around the Shannon and the Shannon River. It powers our homes, it defines our people, it spawned generations of commercial traffic, but also of fishermen, and its offshoot, the Abbey, I suppose, has given different types of boat even into the general maritime history. So I suppose it's no coincidence then, Matt, that it was to the river that people turned for leisure. And the first boat clubs in Limerick would have been built or conceived of in the mid-1800s.
Correct. I suppose it's an interesting point to look at before we look at the boat clubs per se, to examine the role of the sports club in the development of sport in the second half of the 19th century. Because as we've discussed on previous occasions, there was a sports revolution in the second half of the 19th century, where sports were organised firstly in Britain and then worldwide. And one of the main vehicles for the development of sports of all sorts was the sports club. And this in turn was part of what was known as associational culture, where people joined voluntary clubs. The clubs all had a similar structure. First of all, it was not compulsory to join, it was voluntary. You paid a subscription. The clubs were governed by a committee which was elected annually at an AGM. You usually had a secretary, or chairman, a secretary, treasurer. Proper accounts were kept. There was accountability. I suppose from the point of view of sports, where the club played a vital role was that, one, it provided continuity. Before the development of the sports club, a one-off event might be organised, a hurling match or a race or whatever, a horse race. But then those who organised it went away about their business, went their separate ways. But with a sports club, there was continuity there. The club provided the means by which the events were held, and whatever the purpose of the club was, be it the promotion of rugby, soccer, hurling, horse racing, rowing, that was the purpose of the club. The second thing then, of course, was that the club also had more resources because members paid an annual subscription, accounts were kept. So then there was a fund there always then to promote the activities of the club. But with regard then to the particular development of rowing clubs in Limerick, I'm indebted to some great scholars who have looked at the history of rowing in Limerick at some length, particularly Dennis O'Shaughnessy, who has written some fine articles on the subject, Tom Hayes, who has researched the development of sport in Limerick in general, and also, of course, Paul Rouse, that great historian of Irish sport. So the first, Dennis O'Shaughnessy tells us that really, while people have been using the river, as you pointed out, for centuries, and indeed there would have been informal races, a couple of boatmen might get together and race each other up and down the Shannon or whatever. But organised rowing really only got going in the 1860s. And the first rowing club in Limerick was the Shannon Rowing Club, which was founded in 1866. And one of the major figures in the founding of the club was also, of course, one of the great political and business figures of 9th century Limerick, Sir Peter Tate, founder of the Limerick Clothing Factory. And among many other things, he provided the means by which the Shannon Rowing Club came into existence, because he was able to provide funds and so on. There was also a Father James Purcell, who it is said gave the club its name and gave it the colours which it still retains. So initially, when Shannon was founded, of course, it didn't operate from its present premises. It had a premises in Thomas Street, and it used a place in Cork for its actual for its boat shed.
It's quite interesting that a club that would have formed back in those days would have had such an ecumenist coming together as well, through Peter Tate and the local parish priest.
That is correct, because when it started, of course, it's ironic that when boat clubs started in the 1860s, they were actually very exclusive. So the sort of informal rowing competitions that had occurred before that, these would have been obviously local boatmen and fishermen, but they were really debarred from entering these clubs that were founded. Shannon in 1866, Limerick in 1870, because of course there was a fairly substantial annual subscription to be paid, and then the membership then was determined by a system of blackballing and whiteballing. So if I, for example, decided I wanted to join Shannon or Limerick Boat Clubs, it would go to the vote of the committee, and if a certain number of the committee put a black ball into a vase or a jar or whatever, then I wouldn't be allowed to join. And this happened actually in 1899 to great public controversy, when the mayor of Limerick at the time, John Daly, who was a Fenian, he applied to join Shannon Rowing Club, because every mayor since 1866, since Tate, had been a member, but because Daly was a Fenian, he was blackballed, and he was really, really furious, because he was a respectable businessman. He was a baker, and his family were quite well to do, but it's thought that he wasn't admitted to the club because of his what would have been regarded extreme political views. So instead then, a group of his admirers got clubbed together, bought him a boat and presented it to him, much to the annoyance, of course, of Shannon Rowing Club.
Oh, the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's no doubt about it. Let's peel back, Matt, again. So Shannon Rowing Club was the first set up, pretty much, that we recall of. Now, I do know that in the mid-60s, and obviously all the way through, there has been other boat clubs have arisen and have gone out of business as well over that period of time. So Limerick Boat Club then would have been formed in 1870. And this brings in a lot of the characters that we've spoken about previously, and a lot of the great and the good of the merchant class of Limerick. That's correct.
There was a tendency, certainly by the end of the 19th century, to regard Limerick Boat Club as the Unionist and Protestant club, and Shannon Boat Club as the Catholic and Nationalist club. But both clubs really were drawn from the elite of Limerick. And if you look at, say, when Limerick Boat Club was established in 1870, its first president was William Spillane, a prominent tobacco merchant and mayor of Limerick. Other members of the club would have been Sir James Spate and Sir Alex Shaw, who were Protestants and major business figures in the city. And the ethos of Limerick Boat Club was shown by the manner in which, for example, in 1901, they flew the flag at half-mast on the death of Queen Victoria. And not only, of course, were Shaw and Spade, whom we've met in earlier contexts, major figures of the club, but so were the Barringtons of Glenstall, where three of the Barrington brothers, Croker, Charles and William, made history in 1876 when they represented the club at an international regatta in Philadelphia. And I suppose I should have mentioned earlier on that the first rowing club in Ireland was established in 1836. It was known as the
Pembroke, yes.
Pembroke, yes, and Trinity in 1847 then followed soon after. So of course the Barringtons then provided a bridge between the Trinity Club and the Limerick Boat Club. Now it's interesting then about the homes of these two clubs, because they were two major rival clubs. And it's interesting to note that Tom Hayes, that great scholar of Limerick sport, he tells us that where the germ of the nucleus of Shannon Rowing Club were actually oarsmen from Cannocks, the actual nucleus of Limerick Boat Club were oarsmen from Todd's, the two great department stores in Limerick at the time, two rival department stores. There was also then a rivalry between the two boat clubs. And then, of course, when it came to establishing themselves, establishing their homes in the city centre, Limerick Boat Club was given a premises on the east side of what was then known as Wellesley Bridge, now Sarsfield Bridge. And this was because the Harbour Commissioners, of course, were very well disposed towards Limerick Boat Club, because the Harbour Commissioners indeed shared a lot of the same members.
And it's also interesting, Matt, isn't it, that it's still known as the Wellesley Pier?
It is correct. That is correct. Wellesley, by the way, for our listeners, was a brother of the Duke of Wellington, who was Viceroy of Ireland, and who actually opened Sarsfield Bridge in 1835. But then, of course, when Limerick Boat Club, then they subsequently built their current clubhouse on this site in 1885. But of course, in the meantime, Shannon Boat Club, who were still they were still based in Cork and Reid, they felt, why can't we also be on Wellesley Bridge? They applied to also have a site there, but the Harbour Commissioners had their reservations, because and I quote, they thought if the clubs if the two clubs were to be adjacent, it would result in bouts of fisticuffs. They did eventually give Shannon permission to have their club across the bridge from Limerick Boat Club, but unfortunately, their actual their misgivings were fully realised, because there were in fact so many bouts of fisticuffs between the members of both clubs that eventually a tunnel connecting the two clubs onto the bridge had to be closed off. And of course, so there's a very interesting story then as well about the building, of course, of Shannon Rowing Club, Boat Club on the bridge, because very unusually at the time, it was open to international competition. They invited architects from all over the world, in fact, but mainly obviously Britain and Ireland, to submit their designs for the club, the new club building. And it was a gentleman called William Clifford Smith who won the commission, and he built the magnificent club, which now houses Shannon Rowing Club. He built it between 1904 and 1906, and in fact he was so happy at getting this commission that he was an Englishman. He actually settled in Limerick, established a thriving architectural practice in Limerick, and among other buildings he constructed in the city and in the county, where the parish hall in Adair, and which is at the very centre of the town, more or less where the road forks to take you to Rathkeil and to Clonshire, and he also constructed a bank building in the city, which is now it's situated on the junction of William Street and Gerald Griffith Street. So it's still, of course, by far the most impressive of the boat club buildings in the city.
Another very interesting point, and I haven't checked this out, so maybe I should have, is that because of the Shaw connection with the boat club, that the insignia for both Limerick Boat Club and Limerick Golf Club are exactly the same.
That would be correct, because we've already discussed, and this is a point that's been made by Tom Hayes in particular, that the administrators were very important in the history of the development of sports clubs in Limerick. And Shaw would have been one of these administrators who was involved in the establishment of Limerick Golf Club. He was a major figure in the establishment and the maintenance of Shannon Rowing Club. Similar to our other great administrator of that period, William Lamb Stokes. And they didn't just confine their administrative activities and their sporting activities to one club. They were in several clubs. And the role of these individuals in the development of organised sports in Limerick is immeasurable, really.
So now we're sitting at the start of the 1870s, and I think it's only fair at this point as well that we point out we're not going to go into the roles of honour for these clubs at this stage, because every one of the clubs has waxed and waned over the years, right. And they've all had some incredible days, and they've had some down days, and they've had good decades and bad decades. But I think what we'll limit ourselves to in this talk is maybe just the history of the clubs and the way in which they have grown. The next club to come on our radar was almost like a foil in some respects to the elite clubs of the Shannon and Limerick that had formed in the 1860s and into 1870. That would have been the Curragower Boat Club, which was around the late 1870s.
Yes, the Curragower Boat Club was established in 1877. It was known as St. John's Boat Club for many, many years. Up to the 1960s and 70s, changed its name to Curragower Boat Club. And it would have drawn more of its membership from actual boatmen and fishermen. And so therefore it would have been, I suppose, a more, some might say, in fact some did say at the time, it was a more authentic sort of a boat club. But it acquired its present premises in 1914. A very interesting story in its own right, because its boat club its premises is on Merchants Quay, and in 1914 this particular premises was signed over to them by no less than the Mayor of Limerick himself, and the premises had previously been used as the morgue by the Port of Limerick. And it's interesting to note that the signatories on this deed were Christy O'Mara was then the president of the club. This is 1914. Joe Sheehan was the treasurer, and Patrick McInerney was the secretary. And most of the St. John's Boat Club members this came from the Irish town area. And but then because it became more associated with the Curragower Falls and so on, it changed its name to the Curragower Boat Club, and it continues under that name to the present. But local families like the O'Farrells, the O'Sullivans, Bennis's, Rails, they were involved in the club for many, many generations. And again, I like yourself, I'm reluctant to mention names because I'm always afraid to omit some name. So it would be the third in the series of the Limerick Boat Clubs.
I suppose, look, going back over many, many generations, and it's a tradition that only died out, and controversially died out, I suppose, after the Shannon scheme. You would have had a lot of people plying their trade on the river, no more than the Abbey fishermen at that stage as well, Matt, and I think they really should be mentioned in all of this as we go through in terms of the boat clubs.
And my great friend and great colleague Sharon Slater, of course, has written a great deal about the tradition of the Abbey fishermen, and the fishermen in Limerick, the Abbey fishermen and the Curragower fishermen, they would have been, I suppose, the pioneers of the development of rowing in Limerick. But of course, in their case, it was part of their job. They weren't doing it just for fun. But as I already mentioned, of course, before the development of organised rowing in the 1860s, there would have been countless informal races, both within these different communities and then between them as well, because there would have been rivalries, of course, between the Abbey and the Curragower fishermen as well.
And there's a whole lexicon of words have come into the language as well. I suppose that we talk about gandolos nowadays, which is a bastardization of the word gondola and you can almost hear the Limerick accent kicking in there on that. And right. Of course, a gandolo is very much a Shannon fishing boat, and of course also the brachan, which was the fishing boat that the Abbey fishermen that used to use over all those years as well. And sadly, again, these had died out, and I know that Gary McMahon and the people in the Island Company currently are reviving a lot of that tradition, which is wonderful to see.
Gary has done marvellous work, of course, in that whole area. His involvement in that project has been absolutely fantastic.
So we'll move on. We'll move on again now, and I suppose the next stop on our whistle stop tour of the boat clubs along the Shannon came about as a direct result, really, of the off season in rugby. It could be said, and a direct link as well to another one of Limerick's great doyens in Bishop O'Dwyer.
Correct. The Athlunkard Boat Club was established then in 1898, and I suppose one of the features of Limerick rowing is the symbiotic relationship it enjoys with Limerick rugby. So, for example, what often happened was that the same men, because it would have been men in those days, of course, the same men played both rugby and were involved in the rowing clubs, and they rowed during the summer and they played rugby during the winter. So there was a strong relationship between, for example, St. Michael's Rowing Club and Young Munsters. And in the case we're just about to discuss now, there was a very strong connection as well between Athlunkard Boat Club and St. Mary's Rugby Club. And it was in 1897-98 that the Athlunkard Rowing Club was established, and it was a group of men in the local area: Jack Gilligan, Larry Shannon, and Brian O'Connor. They were they're regarded as the three founders. They established the club in 1898, and they called it Athlunkard because that was the Athlunkard Street, of course, was the street that was adjacent to where they started out. And very interestingly, they actually didn't get around to, because of course resources were quite difficult to muster in those days. But it wasn't until 1925 that the present clubhouse was constructed. And of course, the great historian of Athlunkard Boat Club would be Willie Whack Gleeson. But one of the most striking features of the club, of course, is the statue outside the club. And it's the only one of its type, as far as I'm aware. Certainly it's the only one of its type in Limerick, but it's also the only one of its type in the whole of Ireland. This statue was actually erected the year after the clubhouse was built. The statue was erected in 1926. It was designed by a local sculptor called Stan Quinn. And the model for the oarsman standing outside the club, standing there proudly now for almost 100 years, was a local oarsman called Jimmy Quinlivan, who was a member of Athlunkard Boat Club at the time and for many years before. So,
yeah, I suppose the other big feature in Athlunkard Boat Club is the absolutely beautiful gates that accompanied off O'Dwyer Bridge down the most beautifully ornate gates. And you know, I would encourage people that maybe after listening to what we were talking about today, that they would go and visit these places, because they're hidden gems in Limerick if you haven't seen them before. They really are. I mean, that wonderful statue is magnificent. You know, the Athlunkard Boat Club itself is a beautiful building. But the story that's told of Bishop O'Dwyer when they were building, and they had a little bit of money left over after buying rugby jerseys, and they went and bought lumber, and they started building this little shack down at where Athlunkard Boat Club is now. And yes. Bishop O'Dwyer happened over the bridge at that point, and he asked somebody what they were doing. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right.
To which they said they were building a boat club, and of course he would have had connections back into the other boat clubs himself at that point, and would have seen the obviously the need for it in the area, and he was one of the early contributors to it himself. And not only that, he told them to go out and knock on the door of every parish priest in Limerick and get money off them as well, and that's how the money started to come in for the building of Athlunkard Boat Club, which is in itself is a lovely story as well.
Fantastic story, because O'Dwyer would have been he was one of the giant figures in Limerick, and of course he also was involved in the establishment of St. Michael's Rowing Club in 1900 or 1901. And I'll speak about St. Michael's for a minute now.
Absolutely, I think we can move on to Michael's at this stage.
Perfect. St. Michael's actually grew out of St. Michael's Temperance Society. Again, the social history behind these clubs is fascinating. St. Michael's Temperance Society had been established in 1839 at the time of Father Theobald Matthew and the Great Temperance Crusade, and it flourished in Limerick for many, many years. And the sheer amount of activities that it was involved in down through the years it was involved in drama, in music, and other types of recreational events, because, of course, the ethos of the society was there's no point in condemning abuse of alcohol if you don't provide some alternative activity for young people to get involved in. And so to that end, they became involved then in rowing, because Shannon Rowing Club left their premises it was at Cork and Ree, and they went, of course, as we already discussed, to the to Sarsfield Bridge, and this premise then became available to St. Michael's Temperance Society. They took it over, and then the idea formed that why not establish another rowing club. So it was either in 1900 or 1901. The date is disputed, but I'm indebted, of course, that great honor for Shaughnessy for this information. So it was established at this period, and Bishop O'Dwyer was a major figure in support of it. And he wasn't always as helpful as he might have been, however, because on one occasion when they suggested having a dance, in the club, he agreed, and he just said then, I have just one proviso, and that is that no women will be allowed. So
you couldn't be having women at dances, Matt, you know.
Yeah, exactly, you know. But another great figure associated with the club is another great sports figure in Limerick, of course, no less a person than Michael Joyce, who was instrumental in the establishment of Curragower Rugby Club in 1884, but also, of course, was MP for Limerick from 1900 to 1918 and was mayor of Limerick on 2 occasions. So,
and it's incredible the way these names keep coming back over and over and over again.
Coming back, exactly. And these were I think these people, their contribution to the life of Limerick was enormous. And I suppose because of the passage of time, it probably isn't maybe as well remembered as it might have been. Another major figure associated with St. Michael's was a man called Michael Hartley, who was probably sadly forgotten now, but he was a major figure as well because he was mayor of Limerick. He was a major figure in the War of Independence. His wife was killed actually in 1923 in Adair during the Civil War. But also Michael Hartley was the first rowing correspondent in the entire country. Again, Dennis O'Shaughnessy, that wonderful historian, tells us that under the pen name of Number 7, Michael Hartley began writing rowing notes for the Limerick Leader in 1918, the first such rowing correspondent in the entire country.
That really was wonderful. We're also indebted in terms of the Limerick Leader, who really all through the rowing years have been very, very good on rowing and in maintaining. Aspirant, who was their correspondent for many years, he had that nom de plume, and I often wonder if a man that we've mentioned quite a few times already may have had a hand in that somewhere along the line in terms of being aspirant, and maybe he was an aspirant to rowing himself. But the Limerick Leader obviously have done a wonderful job in maintaining the records of all of what we have. Moving along the river, Matt, and I mean St. Michael's. Just reading the history of St. Michael's from my own point of view in preparation for this today, I was just blown away by the amount and breadth of what they had actually done over the years. I know from listening to my own parents and people of that generation that they would have spoken about the dances in St. Michael's always, and the snooker halls and the table tennis, and I mean St. Michael's was very, very much part of what Limerick is, and for a whole generation of people. Really, it was the pastime for Limerick, between that on one side and the LPYMA on the other side, and actually what amazed me again was the crossover between the two. That you would say, and I suppose again for people to understand that St. Michael's was the inner city parish, and that's where the name would have emanated from very much back in those days as well, and that's where the whole St. Michael's thing came from. But the rowing club grew out of all of the other things, and then almost branched off into its own kind of in the early part of the last century.
That's right. I suppose it's interesting you pointed out about the connection, about the friendly relations that St. Michael's enjoyed with the LPYMA, because St. Michael's would have been a staunchly Catholic club insofar as it had very strong connections with the Archconfraternity of the Mount St. Alphonsus, the Redemptorist Archconfraternity. In fact, one of the rules of St. Michael's Club was that you had to be a member of the confraternity before you gained admittance to the club. And they also, of course, attempted to continue the temperance tradition. And there was attempts made to enforce a rule that all the oarsmen should be teetotalers, which apparently didn't always work out as well as it might have done, as one can imagine. But you're quite right, actually. You're right in that not just St. Michael's, but all the rowing clubs, they became major social centres as well. People had their 21st, people had their 40th birthdays, people had their all sorts of social events there. There were quizzes, there were parties, there were Christmas events. And of course, in relation to, for example, Shannon Rowing Club, it is described as by one of its stalwarts as a second family, and the same was true of all of them. So I suppose this brings us back to where we started really in our discussion. that the sports club was instrumental in making sport an integral part of our lives, not only because of the institutional strengths it brought, but also because it provided a total experience. Many of us are familiar with that, I suppose, from the GAA and from rugby, but it was also true of the rowing clubs that all your friends were drawn from these clubs. The clubs would have organised many other events besides the actual competitions themselves. People were born, they grew up, they died as part of the rowing club. And definitely at the funerals, I mean, for example, of members of the club, guards of honour would be formed. A very striking feature of the rowing clubs would be the manner, of course, in which the oarsmen would draw the up side and then would accompany the coffin to the hearse and so on. You know, these were really visible signs of how important the rowing clubs were in the life of Limerick for what, 150 years.
And I know that we joked a little bit earlier on about Limerick and Shannon rowing clubs and the fisticuffs, but a marked tradition right the way throughout all of the years has been how they've cooperated together. And indeed, Athlunkard Boat Club was given a gift in its first year of a boat and oars from Limerick Boat Club way back then, and how, you know, when various clubs were undergoing renovations, that they were allowed to operate out, and indeed for many years I know that Athlunkard Boat Club facilitated that, and you know, I think all of that needs to be mentioned as well. And but you're right, you know, we're defined in Limerick by what rugby club we support, by what boat club we're a member of, and Limerick is almost defined along social strata. It doesn't matter whether you're Protestant or Catholic. In Limerick, it's what rugby club you support. It's of far more interest.
Right.
Listen, Matt, I think we've taken a trip around the boat clubs in as much as we possibly can, and I'm also conscious that there are other boat clubs out there, the likes of Castleconnell Boat Club, that are on the river. But we've tried to limit ourselves a little bit, I think, to just that stretch of river that we call the city centre. I think in this current talk, and perhaps there might be another day when we could look at the others. But listen, thanks so much again for all your work on this. I think we've tried to do them proud, and I hope that the people from the boat clubs, and indeed if people want to contact us, they can contact you, Matt. I know through the museum, and you might just give out your
museum.ie is my email address.
You might just give that out again. Sorry, I think we broke up.
Museum@limerick.ie.
So if anyone wants to contact you, they're more than welcome to do so on that. And George@sportinglimerick.com is my address. So listen, I think that's where we leave it for today. Many thanks, Matt, and thank you for all your help as always.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
God bless.